You may ask, okay, let's assume a person speaks Lashon Harah. Then all of a sudden he invokes the court proceedings against them, right? Because of Midah Keneged Midah. In other words, you invoke court proceedings not because of the sin of Lashon Harah. Again, just like the strategy of how you defend yourself is not because of the merit, for instance, of compassion. It's the incredible principle of Midah Keneged Midah. The same idea with Lashon Harah. The reason why you invoke judgment isn't because of the sin of Lashon Harah. It's because of the same idea. You badmouth somebody else, then immediately he badmouths you. He has permission to do that when you speak Lashon Harah. This is what we see. And it's very important to understand. You must distinguish between the sin of Lashon Harah and the consequences of Lashon Harah, which are far worse than the sin itself. A very important idea. Now, who does the Mekatreg, the Sultan, have permission to haul into court? Okay, 3 people. The Masaper, the one who talks Lashon Harah, because you talk Lashon Harah, therefore the Sultan can talk Lashon Harah about you, prosecute you. The Shomea, the one who is receiving the Lashon Harah, since you are listening to Lashon Harah, so God says, I will listen to the Lashon Harah of the Sultan. And now these 2 people are understandable. But even the subject is hauled into court. The person that you are speaking about, he also gets schlepped into court. Now, you'll ask me why. I can understand the one who sends the message, who speaks Lashon Harah, because he's speaking Lashon Harah. And even the one who hears Lashon Harah because he is listening, so therefore they listen to the Lashon Harah of the Sultan about him. But what is the guy you're talking about? Why should he get schlepped into court? And the answer to that is the reason why he gets dragged into court is because of another fundamental area called ayan hara, the evil eye. Now the ayan hara is not just a religious term. It's not just an interesting or cute idea. It's not voodoo. What is an ayan hara? God gave the ability of one Jew to drag another Jew into court. Every Jew has such an awesome connection to all the worlds above him, that if he wants, he can drag himself into court, as we see, by Lashon Harah, and he can drag other Jews into court also. Why? Because every Jew is responsible for another Jew. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zel Zeh. Each Jew is responsible for another Jew. We are all interconnected, even though we don't see the connection. In other words, when one Jew says to another Jew, you know, where did he get this new car? A $25,000 car. Where do you get this kind of money? So the other guy says, you know where you get this kind of money? He's a thief. You know, he's a gun-up. He's a thief. This car is probably from all the robbery that he committed against the other guys. Now that's pure Lashon Harah. Okay. Now the one who said the Lashon Harah, he gets called into court. The guy who listened to the Lashon Harah, he gets called into court. And the guy who bought the car, the guy they talked about, the subject, he gets called into court because of ayan hara. Because if a Jew looks at you and is jealous of what you have, in effect what he's saying, you don't deserve this, why should you have it? Then he has the ability to ma'ir the din, to invoke justice against you. And then you get called into court. Forget about Lashon Harah. If a Jew is jealous of you, and he gives you what's called an ayan hara, he has the ability to call you into court where you are judged. Now, if that person was able to get the money to buy the car because God was kind to him and he gave money even though that person didn't deserve it, what happens is now that once he gets called to court, if he doesn't have merits to keep that car, he will lose it. In other words, if he's got the schusim to hold on to what he's got, he will not lose it. And the other person's statement will have no effect. But however, if he does not have the merit to earn that thing, he will lose those things. In other words, the other person, when somebody gives you an evil eye, it doesn't mean that he can damage you. He can't. But he can invoke the just judgment against you. And if you don't have schusim or merits, you will lose what he is after. So in that way, he can tremendously damage you. By calling you into court, that's how he damages you. But of course, you've got to win the case by your own merits. That is called ayin hara. That's why the Chazal say, what things are successful? Those things which are hidden from the eye. Chazal say that. In other words, if you want to engage in an enterprise, anything, and you want to make sure you're not going to lose it, don't tell people about it. Not because they won't speak Lashon Harah, because as soon as they look at you and jealousy begins to arise, you automatically get called into court. Now, one of the greatest ways that a person gives another person ayin hara is through Lashon Harah. When a person says Lashon Harah about you, what he's really saying, giving you, is an ayin hara. He's saying, did you hear what happened to this guy? What he's really saying is, what does this guy deserve what he's getting? Lashon Harah is one of the most frequent instruments used for another concept called ayin hara. That is why the subject gets dragged into court. So the Masapa, the one who talks Lashon Harah, gets dragged into court because Lashon Harah, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. The one who listens to Lashon Harah gets dragged into court. The kitrid is invoked against him because he listened to Lashon Harah. But the subject of the report, the one you spoke about, gets dragged into court because the Lashon Harah itself is an instrument for ayin hara. Now, how does one protect themselves? And the answer is simple. If you do not speak Lashon Harah, then the Satan cannot mekatrig against you. He is powerless to do anything against you. Because God says he doesn't badmouth or speak derogatory about others. He does not cause damage to others. You cannot prosecute him and cause damage to him. He does not listen to Lashon Harah, therefore I will not listen to prosecution against him. Now what happens if two people speak Lashon Harah about you? Then God says, I refuse to hear Lashon Harah about him, this person who is the subject of those two people's conversation, because since he does not speak Lashon Harah, you cannot speak Lashon Harah about him. You see? If you want to protect yourself from an ayin hara, don't speak Lashon Harah, because that also protects you. Just like if you don't speak or listen to Lashon Harah, you never get called into court. The same way, other people can never call you in court for the same reason. Don't speak Lashon Harah and don't listen to Lashon Harah. Therefore, God will not listen to the Lashon Harah or the prosecutory attempt of the Satan, nor can the Satan prosecute you. That's how you protect yourself. What do we begin to see? That Shmiras Halashon, to guard your tongue or not to speak Lashon Harah, denies access to the kitrug itself. And therefore, it is the greatest strategy next to not sinning and doing repentance known to man. Because the chesed that God did is that you are responsible for the very trial proceedings against you. If you are called into court, if you are put on the court calendar, it is your fault, nobody else's. This is what we see. Now, you may ask yourself a question. Well, what happens? You mean to tell me if somebody does not speak Lashon Harah, he will never go to trial? Could you imagine a guy never speaks Lashon Harah? Does that mean he will never be called up in Bezdin? Does that mean he'll go scot-free? How can that be? You just got finished saying that God is not a vatran. God cannot forgo sins. So could you imagine this guy's got 1,000,000 sins to his name? You're going to tell me that because he never spoke Lashon Harah, right? And therefore there's no kitrug against him, he is not going to get tried? We know that God is not a vatran. And the answer is the following. There are two ways that justice is done. In other words, there is a difference between the concept of justice, mishpat, and a concept of din. Mishpat is really judgment, and din is justice. There are two different ideas. They are not the same. If you want to make sure that your sins will be atoned for through Bezdin, then speak Lashon Harah. But the problem is that when they get a hold of you, it's bad news, because if you don't have merits, then they must follow the judicial proceedings, the rules and regulations. And if you deserve a punishment, they will give it to you. But if you get judged by God, let's say you never get called to court because you don't speak Lashon Harah or hear Lashon Harah. What does that mean? That means you never get called to court. Then how are you going to atone for your sins? God is not going to overlook them, and the answer is simple. Of course God is going to bring punishment on you. But since God does not look at these punishments in a courtroom, he can judge them by himself without being subjected to the rules and regulations of court. So he can do whatever he wants even though you have no merit whatsoever. He can judge you based on his kindness. He doesn't have to submit to court. In other words, if you speak Lashon Harah and the court, and you invoke the kitrug, and therefore you are judged regarding your sins, then God himself must submit to the judicial rules and regulations, because that is what he decreed. That if there is a trial, this is what happens. And if you're not merachim, then they're not merachim with you, and so on. You've got to have merits. Therefore, God must follow the system. He voluntarily subjected himself to the system of justice, of trial. But if you don't get called to trial, then God can deal with you in what's called hanogas hayichud. Not, in other words, the fact that he can deal with you the way he wants to deal with you. Then it doesn't make a difference to you if you have no merit. He can do whatever he wants. In the end, you will be atoned, but then he can spread it out over years. He can damage some of your property, not damage your body, and so on. He can do whatever he wants, because he doesn't have to answer to a prosecutor standing in front of him saying that this man deserves so-and-so. So if you want to submit to trial by court, speak Lashon Harah, and then you better hope you have merits, or the midah keneged midah kind of characteristic traits. If you want to submit not to the trial, but to the judge, to meet with him in private, so then he can do whatever he does, he doesn't have to entertain the system itself, then what you have to make sure is don't speak Lashon Harah. Then of course God will judge you, because you cannot earn Olam Haba without doing something to your sins. But it's a whole different treatment. The treatment is gentle. God deals with it in a much more kind way. He spreads it over. He waits. He sends you a little punishment and a little yisur and suffering, and all of a sudden you get the message and you do tshuva. Therefore he never has to send you the rest. He deals with you as a judge, not as a judge in trial. That is the enormous difference. Therefore, what do we see? That it's up to you. That mishpat means you get judged by trial. Din means you get judged by God, without having to take in consideration the rules and regulations of court. And it's up to you. If you go through trial, then you better hope that you have merits or schusim, because that's what you have to have when you are in a court session. That is what you have to have when you are being judged, and when there's a prosecutor, a sultan, being mekatreg. If, however, you are being judged by God, and God does not have to answer to a prosecutor because you have never spoken Lashon Harah, you have guarded your tongue, then he can deal with you however he wants. This is what we begin to see. What do we see so far? An incredible idea that when a Jew speaks Lashon Harah, he drags himself, the one who listens, and the one they speak about into court. Do you wonder why Jews are having so many problems today? Could you imagine, would you call up the DA, the district attorney, and say, by the way, I just stole from this man's store. Will you come and get me? That's exactly what you do when you speak Lashon Harah. What you are doing is like making a private meeting with the mekatreg, the sultan, and saying, by the way, would you like to prosecute me on the following record I have? That's exactly what you're doing. That's suicide. What man in his right mind would do that? It's like washing your dirty laundry in public. Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to disclose or display all your sins before the prosecutor himself? It's like meeting with the DA and saying, by the way, have a field day on me. What you are doing is you are informing the sultan of all your chatoim. That's suicide. What else can I call it? Could you imagine when Jews speak Lashon Harah against each other? Every Jew is dragging every other Jew into court. Could you imagine Jews are talking Lashon Harah, and during the day, one guy on the phone has badmouthed at least 15 people, has dragged, not only, he's dragged himself, all the 15 and all the people they've spoken about. One guy can initiate court proceedings against 100 people in one day. Could you imagine that's one Jew? Multiply that by all the Jews speaking Lashon Harah. Is it any wonder what's happening? It comes out that Jews are all day in court. That's what's happening. Every Jew is every day in court. Could you imagine spending the rest of your life in court every single day? You would commit suicide. You could never take that trauma. Imagine what it is to be on trial every day of your life. It's horrendous. But that's what's happening. When a Jew speaks Lashon Harah, since the only way he can makatrig against you is through Lashon Harah, that's exactly what you're doing. You are informing Mesira on yourself, on the subject, and also on the Shomea, the recipient. And you do it hundreds of times a day. And there are millions of Jews who do this. Can you imagine what's happening to Israel? In other words, it is the Lashon Harah that Jews speak that forces the judgment, the mishpat against Jews. That is why there is so much sorrow on Eden. That is why you find so many people dying young, why you find people who have children who are either into drugs or into crime, why you find businesses going down, people having tremendous financial loss, why you have so many problems in families between parents and child, why there are so many divorces. It's not because of the chet, it's the Lashon Harah. Why? Because remember, you can have a million sins. If he cannot access you to Lashon Harah, he has no access to mishpat, to judgment. Could you imagine never being called to trial? So what Lashon Harah does, it gives him permission to drag everybody into court and to reveal all, expose all your sins in front of a jury, in front of a trial. That is why Jews have such enormous problems. That is what's happening to Judaism today. Very simple. Don't speak Lashon Harah and you will live a great life. Speak Lashon Harah and woe is you. Now, what I'd like to do, now that we understand this framework, let's go back to the Chazal, and you will see how every single Chazal, every single statement of the Gemara and the Medrash, or Pasuk that I said makes incredibly beautiful sense. But not right now you understand the key. Let's take a look. First of all, do we understand now why there's 31 commandments associated with Lashon Harah? Of course. Because why does God hate somebody who speaks Lashon Harah? Not because of the sin of Lashon Harah. That's not what it is. It's because the sin of Lashon Harah opens up the door to the Satan to drag you, the recipient of the Lashon Harah, and the one you speak about. And it gives the Mekatreg access to every sin that you have. That is why God hates it so much. That is why he enumerated 31 commandments directly, indirectly associated with Lashon Harah. That is why. Because it is not the fact that you damage somebody in this world. Because of the peculiarity of Midah Keneged Midah, because the only way the Satan can mekatreg is through Lashon Harah, that is why Lashon Harah takes on an enormous significance. Far more than the fact that Lashon Harah is merely a mazik, or that you damage somebody when you speak Lashon Harah. That is why there are so many commandments that tell you, do not speak Lashon Harah. Makes perfect sense. Also, that is why somebody who speaks Lashon Harah lives a long time. Because why do people die? Because of Lashon Harah activates the judgment against them. And therefore they are found guilty and they have tremendous suffering. And many times they must die because of the sins that they have. If a person doesn't speak Lashon Harah, he never gets called to trial. Therefore he lives a long, long time. Not only lives a long time, but he lives a relatively tranquil life. In other words, the connection between Lashon Harah and longevity is very simple. Don't speak Lashon Harah, don't get judged, and therefore never get punished. And if you do get punished, it's by God, not by the trial, and he deals with you in a totally different way. And that is why the Gemara says, "The boy chayim belishne." You want life? Don't speak Lashon Harah, because there's no kitrug against you. Only God will judge you, not the prosecutor, the Satan. You want death? Speak Lashon Harah. Literally, you want death. In other words, if you want punishment and death, then speak Lashon Harah, because he, the Satan, then has access to every chet that you do. We understand it very simple. And that is why it says that whoever does not speak Lashon Harah has no tsaras. That's what God says. If you do not speak Lashon Harah, God says, I can save you from every tsara. But if you open up your mouth and speak Lashon Hara, forget it. Why? Because if you don't speak Lashon Hara, then I can deal with you. It's between me and you, not between me and you and the Satan. Therefore, I can save you from any tzara. And if I do bring something on you, it'll be very gentle. But if you speak Lashon Hara, I cannot help you because I am forced to submit to the very system that I activated in creation, which is the system of justice that man must earn his olam haba. Very simple. That is why. We also understand why a person, even if he worships idols, why he is not judged. Because as long as you do not speak Lashon Hara, the Satan cannot makatreg. There's no kitrug. So what's the difference if you worship idols? Nobody falls. That is why in the generation of Achov, nobody fell. Because the Satan had no access to the kitrug, even though they were full of avodah zarah. Whereas in the generation of Shaul, since they spoke Lashon Hara, of course they had sins. And even though they were on such an enormous spiritual level, since he had access to their sins, therefore he could destroy them. And that is why they fell when they went to war. Now we understand also another chazal. Why is it that the greatest sin is Lashon Hara? Again, not because of Lashon Hara. It's not the idea of Lashon Hara that is so severe. It is the fact that Lashon Hara allows the kitrug, and therefore that allows the Satan to have access to all your sins and to all Israel's sins. That is why the greatest sin that you could do is Lashon Hara. Not because of Lashon Hara, because of the consequences of Lashon Hara. And also, that is why we understand why is Lashon Hara greater than avodah zarah, which is idol worship, Gili Aroyos, which is of course adultery, incest, or morality, or whatever, and Shvichas Damim, of course, which is murder. Again, Lashon Hara is not worse than them. Lashon Hara is only a mazik. But they only, what can these three sins do for you? They can serve as tremendous transgressions that if you get called to trial, they will stand against you. But as long as you don't speak Lashon Hara, they cannot touch you, those sins. Speak Lashon Hara and they can immediately be used against you. That is why Lashon Hara is worse. Because that which gives a Satan the access to kitrik is much worse than the actual damage, the actual sin that you committed, even if it be those kind of three sins. Again, we understand beautifully what Chazal are saying. And now we understand that why it says anybody speaks Lashon Hara magnifies his sin up to heaven. Of course, because Lashon Hara is not only a mazik, it's not only where you damage somebody. Here, what you do is you create enormous consequences, metaphysical consequences, because you allow the Satan access to kitrig, to prosecute you, of course, in Shemayim. And now we understand also Moshe Rabbeinu. What he asked is, I know that they are Oived Avodah Zarah. I know Jews worship idols, but that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't explain why they suffer so much, because I know they don't speak Lashon Hara. But when he walked out among the Jews and he saw the Lashon Hara, that one Jew would say Lashon Hara, even if it would destroy Moshe Rabbeinu. Could you imagine a Jew informing to Paro? You know, when he did that Jew a favor by killing the Egyptians. So then he said, Ochi noida hadova. Ochi noida hadova means this. The regular pshat, meaning Ochi noida hadova, is surely the thing will be known to Pharaoh. But the real meaning is Ochi noida hadova. Now the matter is known to me why they suffer so much, because they speak Lashon Hara. That's the second meaning. But the true meaning is this. Ochi noida hadova. The fact that they worshipped idols would never be known to heaven. But since they speak Lashon Hara, Ochi noida hadova. Now the matter of their serving idols is surely known. Not to Pharaoh, not to me, but is known to heaven, is known to the prosecutor. That's what Ochi noida hadova really means. Surely this idea or this sin of serving idols is known to Shemayim because they speak Lashon Hara. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu really meant. And of course, it makes perfect sense in terms of all the ideas that we are discussing. And therefore we understand why the decree of the Jews was fulfilled only because of the last test, which is the Meraglim. Because as long as they didn't speak Lashon Harah, even if they failed 9 times, they cannot be judged. As soon as they started speaking Lashon Harah, the Sultan had access to all the sins of Israel, because all Israel listened to the Meraglim. All Israel listened to the Meraglim. The Meraglim were the Masaprim. They said the Lashon Harah, they send the Lashon Harah, and all Israel was the Shemim. That's why the incident of Meraglim, the spies, are so bad. But once they all listened to the Meraglim, that is why the decree, of course, was decided that they must all die. Now we fully understand why. And the last chazal I had brought, of course, is why was the temple destroyed? And the answer is obvious. The temple was destroyed even though they had such great spiritual heights. They reached great spiritual heights. Is because once they spoke Lashon Harah, the Lashon Harah revealed the sins to the Makatreg, and the Kitrig was great enough to destroy them. And there's a very interesting idea. There's a chazal that says that why was Jerusalem destroyed? Why was the temple destroyed? Because it says He'emidu divreim al divrei Torah, that the people in that generation was very exacting. That if you owed them something, they wanted it. They wouldn't overlook any injury or any kind of avlo, any kind of harm you did them. That's what it says. So we see an incredible thing. What revealed to the Sultan their sin is because they spoke Lashon Harah. So they couldn't access the Kitrig aspect. The defensive strategy of Kitrig was neutralized because they spoke Lashon Harah. But maybe they can stop the destruction of the temple by overlooking the sins of others, so God will overlook the sins of Jews. No. Since they did not mavi al midosav, since they held people exactly accountable for what they did to them, therefore God held them accountable. So they couldn't even interface with the strategy of making a motion for dismissal. So that's why there are 2 chazals, that they couldn't intervene in the proceedings either way. They couldn't stop the Makati because they spoke Lashon Harah, and they couldn't make a motion for dismissal because they were rigid. If you did a wrong to me, I am going to go after you. Of course they went after the guy because the guy did a wrong to the guy. But since they did not mavel midosav, therefore they couldn't make a motion for dismissal. That's why there are 2 chazals saying the same thing, because there seems to be a contradiction. Why was the temple destroyed? Because they spoke Lashon Harah, or because they exacted justice? What does one have to do with the other? Sounds like, which is it, this or this? But from what is being said, it's beautiful, because there are 8 ways to interface with that system, and the Chazal are merely pointing out the different ways. They spoke Lashon Harah, so they couldn't hide it from the Satan, and they couldn't dismiss the motion. They couldn't make a motion of dismissal because they called the person. They insisted on the letter of the law. Therefore, God, unfortunately, had to insist on the letter of the law, since they dragged God into court to judge them. And unfortunately, the enormous consequence was, of course, the destruction of the temple. Now, if you think so far that what you have heard is incredible idea of the power of speech, this is the true power of speech. But if you think you know the full story of the true power of speech, you are making a mistake. I will tell you something else which is even greater than what I have told tonight. It's more mind-boggling. If you think the devastating consequences of Lashon Harah is what I said tonight, this is child's play compared to something else that I will tell you, which is awesome in its devastating consequences to Klal Yisrael. And we will speak about that shortly. So far, we have dealt with many chazals, many sayings of the chazal, our rabbis, concerning Lashon Harah. And what we see so far is that according to our framework, we are actually able to answer these sayings of the chazal. However, when we begin to look at the other sayings of chazal, we begin to realize that the framework that we have is really insufficient to answer all the chazals. In other words, what we begin to see is that we don't really understand the full repercussions of speaking Lashon Harah. There is an aspect to the dimension of Lashon Harah which we are lacking, we are ignorant of. It is that second dimension that we have to clarify in order to understand the other chazals. And the truth is that this second dimension, which we need in order to satisfy our understanding of the other chazals, that the truth of these ideas are so earth-shaking, so to speak, that it's very difficult to listen to and hear it and not walk away, very much impressed. Now, in the Shir, there are many things that occur in Hashkafa, many ideas in Hashkafa, which are esoteric. Esoteric means that many people do not know about these ideas. They are part of the secrets of the Torah. They are ideas which only people who are really learned spend many hours learning. Only these people really know these ideas. However, in order to stop Lashon Harah, in order to enable people to be shomed the Lashon, not to speak Lashon Harah, we must enter an area which in truth is esoteric. It's an area where most people have no knowledge of. It can be looked on almost as some kind of a secret doctrine. However, because the intent of the Shir is to get people not to speak Lashon Harah, therefore it is fully justified to talk about these areas. In fact, it's interesting to note that the way the Satan wins is because of our ignorance. He is able to do what he's able to do because we lack the understanding of what is really going on, how he really succeeds in doing what he wants to do. And the reason why he succeeds, of course, is we really don't understand what is happening. We don't understand the effect of our actions, the effect of our speech. And if we did understand the effect of our speech, we would immediately refrain from speaking Lashon Harah. And therefore, I'm going to go into certain areas, even though it's not known, but it is crucial to know it in order to stop speaking Lashon Harah. And that itself is full justification why we should endeavor to comprehend these areas. Let us go back to the beginning of Bereshis. Let's see, actually, let us take a look and see what chazals that are extant that we really cannot understand with the framework that we have so far. There's a chazal that says, "Eina gishomim ne'etzoren elo bishvil misapli Lashon Harah." Rains are withheld because of people who speak Lashon Harah. Now the question, of course, is why are rains withheld? Now, according to our previous framework, where we see that if somebody speaks Lashon Harah, it gives the Satan access to kitrug, and it is his kitrug, his prosecution, that is able to hold us into court, the divine court. That's what we saw from last week. But when we take a look at this chazal, what does this chazal have to do whether we get called into court or not? We understand so far that if we speak Lashon Harah, it gives the Satan permission to makatreg, to prosecute, to alert the court to sit in judgment. What does this have to do with rains being withheld because we speak Lashon Harah? Obviously, there's something that we're missing. Chazal understands something about Shmiras Halashon, or Lashon Harah, that we do not understand at all. That is one chazal. Another chazal is very similar, where it says that Hamasap Lashon Harah mizonesav misma'atin. He who speaks Lashon Harah, his livelihood is diminished. Now that obviously is similar to the fact that rains are withheld, because rains, of course, is the basis of all agriculture, which is, of course, the basis for our eating supplies, our livelihood. Again, what does Lashon Harah have to do with the fact that livelihood is diminished? What does one have to do with the other? And when Chazal say something, they mean exactly what it says. They do not exaggerate. This isn't from a raid, as they call it. This isn't religious talk. When Chazal say that if you do A, B ensues, then B is a true result, a logical result of A. Therefore, we must understand, why is it that rains are withheld? Why is it that livelihood is diminished? Another Chazal that says that those kat misapli Lashon Harah, those people who speak Lashon Harah, ein mekabels pnei Shechina, they will not be worthy of receiving the divine presence. They will not receive the Shechina. Why not? Again, we cannot answer this Chazal based on our previous framework. Another similar chazal is where it says, Kol HaMesapeh Lashon Harah, Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Anybody who speaks Lashon Harah, God says, Ein ani v'hu yocholin l'dor ba'olam. I and he cannot live in the same world. So therefore God exits. The same idea. That we see that in some way, if you speak Lashon Harah, you affect the presence of the Shekhinah. You can actually diminish the presence of the Shekhinah. Again, how? We cannot understand it based on our previous framework. We see again, Kol ha'omer Lashon Harah, anybody who speaks Lashon Harah, Mesalek ha'Shekhinah milmata l'mayla, will actually succeed in removing the Shekhinah from below to on high. Somebody speaks Lashon Harah actually pushes the Shekhinah out. And again, this is similar to the previous Chazal. And we, of course, do not understand what does the removal of the Shekhinah have to do with speaking Lashon Harah. This is what we have to answer. Another Chazal, where it says, Omar Kodesh Baruch Hu, God said, B'olam hazeh, in this world, ayedei shahoyu benechem bali Lashon Harah, because there is amongst you those who speak Lashon Harah, solakti eshchinosi mi benechem, I have removed my Shekhinah. However, aval osed lovoi, in the future world, shani oike yetzer hara mi benechem, when I will of course remove the yetzer hara, the evil inclination from amongst you, ani marze shchinosi benechem, I will restore the divine presence amongst you. Again, a specific reference to one who speaks Lashon Harah, you remove the Shekhinah. And of course, what's the idea? Another idea, the famous statement, L'chol Yerushalayim b'migdash sheni, that the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of the sin of Lashon Harah that was amongst them. And we know the essence of the destruction of the second temple was that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, left. That's really what it means. We're not interested if a building was destroyed. What is the essence of the destruction of the second temple, of course, is that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, left from amongst the midst of the Jews. Again, we see that he who speaks Lashon Harah somehow affects the removal of the Shekhinah. Another Chazal, that if somebody speaks Lashon Harah, it is oile ad kisya kovod. The effects of speaking Lashon Harah, the ramifications, transcends the heavens until it reaches the divine throne. Now, when you're talking about the effects of Lashon Harah reaching the divine throne, that means in some way the divine throne of God is affected. The seat where God sits, kavyochol, means of course God does not sit, but in some way the presence of God is enormously disturbed because your Lashon Harah actually touches or blemishes the divine throne. What does that mean? That's an incredible statement. How a sin of Lashon Harah, which is basically conceptually a mazik, that's all it is, can actually pogam, can create a defect in the kisya kovod, in the divine throne of God. That's incredible. Another statement, Kol HaMesapeh Lashon Harah ki'ilu kofer b'ikar. Anybody who speaks Lashon Harah is as if he denied the existence of God. That's an incredible statement. What does your speaking Lashon Harah have to do with denying or admitting the presence of God? Really? Of course, there are people who say, well, if you speak Lashon Harah, and most people speak Lashon Harah say it in quiet, so they think nobody hears. And that's why they speak Lashon Harah. So it's as if they feel that God does not exist, because if they felt he would exist and be all over, they would not speak Lashon Harah. That is the simple meaning of that chazal. But the truth is, there is an incredible profundity in that chazal, that if you speak Lashon Harah, in reality, it's as if you really denied the presence of God, not because your actions would indicate that, but the manifestations, the consequences of the sin of Lashon Harah is a denial of the presence of God. There's a much greater meaning than that. Also, there is a Vilna Gaon who quotes a medrash that says, it's a famous gra, but I'll repeat it because it really has to be understood. Al kol rega v'rega, on every second, she'odem chuisim piv, that a man shuts his mouth and does not speak Lashon Hara, zicha, he merits lior hagonos, to a concealed knowledge, which is so great, she'ein kol malach ubriya yochel l'shaya. It is inconceivable to any angel that knowledge which will reveal to you as a result of speaking Lashon Harah. That's what the Gro says in the name of a Medrash. That for every second that you do not speak Lashon Harah, you will merit a comprehension of such a nature that the greatest malachim, angels, can't even touch that comprehension. And the answer is why? Why Lashon Harah? Why not just say every mitzvah you do, you will merit that kind of a perception? Why is it if you don't speak Lashon Harah, you will be privy to a knowledge which is so awesome that the greatest angelic beings can't even touch it? Incredible medrash. But it is something that we must seek to answer. And as we see, that these chazals are not understandable, they're not intelligible based on our previous framework. Because even if we understand that a person is called to Bezin as a result of his Lashon Harah, what does it have to do with the Shechina, to the Kisei HaKavod, the divine throne, to the reward of the Or HaGonas, a concealed knowledge? What does it have to do with all this? Therefore, we come to the conclusion that there is an area of Lashon Harah which we must investigate, which we must have in order to explain these ideas. Let us now begin pursuing the understanding that will sufficiently answer these chazals. And you will see that in order to understand these chazals, we must understand many mysteries of creation. We must have a much greater understanding of the internal mechanism of creation. And that is what we are going to go into tonight. Now, let us begin from Bereshis. In the beginning, what do we see? We see that there's a nochash, a snake. And this snake is trying to tempt man. That's the first scenario that we encounter. Okay, we have a nochash, and he's trying to tempt Chava and Adam, Harishon of course, Adam and Eve, in order to do a sin. Now, who was this snake? Well, this snake is really this primordial snake, or the Nochash HaKadmoni as they call him, the first snake. What he really was is the physical manifestation of the Sultan himself. The Nochash himself represented the Yetzer Hara. In other words, the Yetzer Hara in the time of Adam Rishon, before the sin, before the fall of man, was external to man. It is not like we have it today where the Yetzer Hara is in the psyche of man. In those days, the Yetzer Hara was external to man. And he was nislabesh. In other words, he manifested itself in this creature called a snake. Very important to know. Now, however, there was a difference the way man related to this snake, this Yetzer Hara, before the sin, and there's a difference the way he relates to the snake after the sin. Enormous difference. What is that difference? What is the distinction? All things derive their existence from God. The existential source of all beings comes only from the Rebbeinu Shalom. And not only that, all things continuously derive their existence from God and from no one else. Beings don't even have to fulfill conditions to exist. They exist to achieve certain specific tasks. Therefore we see that the existential source of all things is God himself. From no one else, and there are no conditions for a being to exist. It was created and sustained in order to do a task. It exists because each being is locked into the Rebbeinu Shalom. God, who is existence per se, feeds existence to all beings, and therefore he gives it existence. In other words, all things have their existence, their sustained existence, and the power in order to accomplish their tasks from the Rebbeinu Shalom and from no other source. This connection that beings have to God is a result of the hashpor or shefa that God gives all entities. What is the idea of a hashpor or a shefa? A shefa simply means that God causes to be. He sends or he creates a causative force that actually creates an entity. That's a shefa, a hashpor. It's an influence, the divine influence. So when we say something exists because of the hashpor, or the shefa from God, we are really saying that a thing exists, the entity exists, because it receives an influence from God. So the word hashpor, shefa, means a divine influence, a divine cause that makes a thing be. Now, the Nachash, the snake, or the Yetzer Hara, had its own connection to God. It exists because God created it to do the work of seduction of man. It has its own power. It has its own existence from the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is called Unika. It's unique from God. All beings are unique from God. They derive their nourishment, their existence, their power from God Himself. That's called Unika, or nourishment. And the Satan had his own Unika from God. The Satan is unique from God. He derives his nourishment, his existence from the Rebbeinu Shalom. And this existence, this power that he has to seduce, to entice man, of course, the power he gets from the Rebbeinu Shalom, and only from the Rebbeinu Shalom. And there are no conditions under which he can derive this nourishment. He has it because he's got to do his task. This is the way the Nachash was, the Satan was before the fall of man. Now, the Satan goes over to Chava and tries to give her an argument, to try to tempt her into sinning, which means to eat from the tree of knowledge, of the knowledge of good and evil. What was the test? The test concerned what's called the Yichud Mitziusoi test. What does that mean? The Nachash argument was as follows. The reason why the Rebbeinu Shalom told you not to eat from the tree is because, as Rashi says this, and Rashi brings down the Medrash, the tree is really the source of all being. And God ate from that tree, and that is how God had the power to create the world. And obviously God is jealous of you. He doesn't want you to be a rival of His. Therefore He tells you not to eat from the tree. This is what the Nachash told Adam. Now, Adam Harishon realized what's called Yichud Shlitosai. He understood that God is the most powerful thing he ever saw. He was created in the sixth day of creation, and when he was created, creation was formed. Who made all this? He knew it was the Rebbeinu Shalom. Obviously, he who was capable of making such an incredible universe, and the universe Adam Rishon perceived was much more than we do. This must mean that God is mind-boggling in his ability to create. The shlita, the mastery of God that God has, must be awesome if he can do this. Now Adam knew this. What Adam did not know, and it was concealed from Adam in order that he should be tested regarding this fact, is the fact that God is not only Yichud Shlitosoi, that God is the master of creation, the ultimate power, but God is Yichud Mitziusoi. He is the source of being. That is very different than just being the power over everything. And Adam had to figure out, through whatever intellectual processes he had available to him, that the Nachash is wrong, that God created everything including the tree. It is not the tree that's Yichud Mitziusoi, it is the Rebbeinu Shalom that is the Yichud Mitziusoi. Therefore Adam had what's called a hester. There was a concealment of the Mitzius of God, not the Shlita of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And here his test was in that Mitzius. Would he understand that God is the true source of all being? Even more, that God is existence itself. Would he understand that? And of course Adam did not understand that. He fell. He saw God only as a Yichud Shlitosoi, that God was of course supreme in his reign, in his mastery of creation. But not that God himself was the absolute being of all. He fell. He accepted the advice of the Nachash. He bought his argument. He received the counsel of this snake, this Nachash HaKadmoni, or the Satan himself, the Yetzer Hara. What were the consequences of his accepting that advice? It was awesome. As a result of that, the Bria changed. Creation changed in many ways. One of the ways it changed is that man would now relate differently to the Satan than he did before. First of all, the Satan now became internalized in the mind of man. In other words, we now carry around our own private Yetzer Hara. No more is the Yetzer Hara outside the body trying to offer us convincing logical arguments. The Yetzer Hara, of course, is in the mind of man, imbuing him with tremendous drives and giving him arguments internally, psychically, why he should do what he wants to do. Therefore, that's one way the Bria changed. What the Rebbeinu Shalom did is he did the following. He said, until now, your task was to reject the advice of the Nachash, to see through the flimsy argument that he was offering you. In other words, your task was to remove the ignorance that you were in, namely, that God is the Yichud Mitziusoi, He is the source of all being, He is existence itself. You accepted that advice, therefore you accepted His advice, and not only that, you accepted His friendship as one who could give you that advice. Your task will now be two. You must reject His advice, but more than that, you must destroy the Satan. You accepted His advice and His friendship, you must now destroy the Satan and reject His advice. Twofold. Because you decided to receive His friendship and His advice, not only must you reject His advice, that's task number one, but task number two is you must destroy the Satan himself. How? How do you destroy the Satan? What the Rebbeinu Shem did is an incredible event. He changed the nature of the Satan, and He connected it to man. What does that mean? What that means is that man now exists in an inverse relationship to the Nachash. Before, the Yanika of the Satan would derive his existence and his power to do his task, his Yanika, his nourishment. He would be unique from God directly. And he would be unique from God no matter what happened. What the Rebbeinu Shem did is he said, no more will you be unique from me directly. He's talking to the Satan. Now you will be unique from man, and man will be unique from me. In other words, man derives his power and his existence from God. The Satan or the Nachash derives his power and his existence from man, not from God. Which is really an incredible idea. That means the Satan must beg man to exist. No more can he derive his Yanika from the Rebbeinu Shalom. He's got to get it from we. And if we don't give it to him, you know what happens to him? He dies. Because that's what we must do. We must kill him, and we must reject his advice. Two ideas. Now, where do we see this in the Chumash? Sounds like a nice idea, but where do you see it in the Chumash? Okay, we are going to learn the Chumash differently than it's learned normally. Because the truth is that the same psukim that reveal the simplified pshat reveal the true nature of what goes on, the hidden theme of creation. The Rebbeinu Shem says to the Satan, Oro ato mikol behemo mikol chayas hasoda. Cursed are you from all the animals and the wild animals of the field. You will now crawl on your belly. What does that mean? What that means is that the Medrash says that before this, the Satan or the Nachash, the snake, had feet. God said you will no more have feet. You will crawl on your belly. You know what that really means? What it means is until now you were independent. You could stand on your own 2 feet. You didn't have to ask somebody to move you. Your feet will be removed. Now you are dependent on your existence on somebody else. Who is that? Man. That's what it means. He removed the independence that the Satan had, that the Nachash, the snake, had. No more would the snake be dependent for its existence and power on God. It would now remove its feet. It would now be dependent on the ground, metaphorically. It would be dependent on man. V'ofa toichal, you are going to eat dirt. What dirt is that? Sin, chet, is dirt. Now you're going to have to eat the chet of man. That is your yanika. That's your sustenance. If you don't eat his dirt, you die. And what will result if you eat his dirt? Obviously, the game now that exists between us and the Satan is no more he has a job to seduce us. He must seduce us or he dies. Survival is the name of the game. We are rivals. It is a battle to the death. Therefore, we will hate the Satan and he will hate us because we are both contending for one source of Yanika, one power source, one cable which is connected to man and the Satan at the same time. If we eat, he dies. And if he eats, we chas v'shalom die. That's the way it works. Therefore, the Rebbeinu Shem says, V'eva ashes beincho ubeino isha. Therefore, I will place hatred between you and the snake. Now, what does that mean? If you think about it, why should the Satan hate us before we understood this relationship? But now you understand. He hates us because we have his nourishment. Of course he hates us. It follows logically. Because before this explanation, why should the snake hate us? We can hate him because he seduces us to do sin. But why should he hate us? Because now that he derives his nourishment from man, who gets it from God, of course he hates us. And of course what the ultimate conclusion will be, Hu yeshif chorosh, ve'ata tishifenu okev. He will try to destroy you, bruise you, and you will try to destroy him. It is now what? It is a battle to the death. Survival is the issue between us and the Satan. He is no more merely a messenger to try to seduce us into doing a sin. He must seduce us. He must get us to sin. If not, he dies. He shrivels. He becomes impoverished and he dies. We and he are rivals for one source of Kedusha, one source of the Shefa that comes from God. This is the state that exists now. And it is now possible for us to destroy the Satan, because if we do certain acts, then he does not get our nourishment, he dies. If we do other kinds of acts, then he derives nourishment from God via us. And of course he lives. And of course we begin to suffer. Now, you may ask a tremendous question, and you say, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. If the only way the Satan can get his kitrug is if we speak Lashon Harah, and when the Satan is mekatreg, why does the Satan mekatreg now? Why does the Satan prosecute us in court? Because that's his job? Because he wants to punish us? No. Because as a result of the kitrug, if we are found guilty, he eats from our sin. In other words, the kitrug is his yanika. The Satan now prosecutes us not to do a job, but to live and survive. If he prosecutes us, if he's mekatrig us, he lives, he survives. If he doesn't mekatrig us, he dies. In other words, without kitrug, there is no yanika to the Satan, which is an incredible idea. That if the Satan cannot mekatrig, he cannot live. He can only live if he brings us to court, we are found guilty, and he now derives the nourishment, the kedusha that we would have gotten had we not sinned. He now takes it for himself. In other words, when he is mekatrig, he is not really interested in us being punished. What he wants is his nourishment. He wants to survive. That is the issue that now happens. So we can ask a tremendous question. The Satan can appear before God and say, wait a minute. If the only way I can survive is by being mekatreg, and if man controls my kitrig by speaking Lashon Harah, in other words, if man speaks Lashon Harah, then I can badmouth him. Mida keneged mida. So therefore I get my sustenance, my nourishment. If he doesn't speak Lashon Harah, I can't mekatreg. So the Satan says I wind up dying. Why? It's not fair. If my survival is not dependent on man's sin, so then I don't care if I have to wait to prosecute until he speaks Lashon Harah. But if I survive on his Lashon Harah, it's not fair. Why do I have to wait for his Lashon Harah to prosecute? He's going to die in the meantime. It's a tremendous complaint to the Rebbeinu Shalom. So the Rebbeinu Shalom turns around to him and says, no, you are wrong. Who is the first one who spoke Lashon Harah in creation? You know who it was? The Satan. Why? It's amazing that the first recorded conversation in history already had Lashon Harah in it. It couldn't even wait until later on. What did the Satan say? The Satan said that God himself is powerless. He derives his power from the tree. What is that? That's mighty Shemra. He is denigrating God by saying that God is not what you think he is. He is much more weaker than you think he is. But it's more than that. It's a lie. It's mighty Shemra. The Satan is the first being that spoke mighty Shemra, the first being that spoke Lashon Harah. And the Rebbeinu Shalom said that you had no right to speak Lashon Harah. If you wanted to entice Adam, then do it in some other argument. Where did you get the right to badmouth me? Therefore, it is true that man can invoke kitrig by speaking Lashon Harah. But since you spoke Lashon Harah to make man sin, and you spoke it unjustly, you were not right in speaking. Therefore, even though your survival is now dependent, your kitrig, or rather your survival is dependent on his sins, since you spoke Lashon Harah wrongly, mida keneged mida on you, measure for measure. You spoke Lashon Harah in order to gain, or rather to make man sin, and it was unjust, it was wrong of you to do that. Therefore, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. You will have to wait for his Lashon Harah in order for you to survive. Because since you spoke Lashon Harah, Mida Keneged Mida, you must wait for his Lashon Harah in order to Mekatreg, in order to survive. So therefore, you have no argument. Now, even though you will survive as a result of the sins of man, so therefore your kitrik actually gets you nourishment, you have no excuse. Since you spoke Lashon Harah against me unjustly, therefore the only way you can get yenika, nourishment from man, the only way you can mekatreg is by allowing, or rather waiting for man's Lashon Harah. That's the only way. And that is why a snake has no voice. A snake can utter no sound. It only hisses. It cannot utter any voice. Why? Because what that means is that the one who is represented by the snake also has no voice. He must wait for the voice of man. Before he can utter a sound in Bezdin, mekatreg, prosecute, he must wait for the voice of man, which is Lashon Harah. If man speaks Lashon Harah, then he can speak Lashon Harah on man. If man does not speak Lashon Harah, he cannot speak Lashon Harah on man, he cannot mekatreg, and therefore he dies. And that is why the snake that physically represents the Satan has no voice also. The voice of the Satan is dependent on the voice of man. Okay, that's in terms of the complaint of the Satan. What do we see so far? We see what's beginning to appear is that there's an inverse relationship between man and the Satan. That in order for Satan to survive, to be sustained, and to have power, he must mekatreg to prosecute us. He must, and he can only do that, of course, if man speaks Lashon Harah. Because the kitra gives him access to the Bezdin, and it is the sins of man that feeds him. In other words, instead of the holiness that is supposed to come to man, the hashpor that is supposed to come to man, instead the Satan takes it because as a result of our sins. What that means is the following, that only man and the sitra achra, only man and the Satan actually grow and diminish. If we do mitzvahs or commandments, we grow in kedusha. If we don't, we diminish. If we sin, he grows. And if we do mitzvahs, he diminishes. The only two beings in creation that grow and diminish is man and the Satan. No other spiritual entity grows or diminishes. There is no other change by any spiritual entity. Only the Satan and man. Man grows, he waxes and wanes, and the Satan waxes and wanes depending on man's growth or man's diminishment. Not only that, we see that the Satan must wait for the acts of man. He cannot initiate his own yenika. He must wait for man to act. So therefore he tries to get man to sin. If man sins, then he's mekatreg, or rather if man speaks Lashon Harah, he's mekatreg, because we saw before that if man sins and does not speak Lashon Harah, the Satan cannot have access to the kitrug. He cannot even have access to the yenika of the chet. He can only have access to the yenika of the chet if man speaks Lashon Harah and he's mekatreg. Only through kitrug can the Satan exist. Without kitrug, the Satan dies. Therefore, we see that the Satan must wait for the acts of man, and it depends what man does. What do we begin to see? The following. That mitzvahs, or if a man does appropriate acts, which are called mitzvahs, commandments, then the following things happen. One, that the being of man is sustained. Man's being is sustained. He exists further. Okay. Not only that, but he has access to the kedusha flow, which comes between man and God. What that is, the flow itself is really what's called yichud. When you are connected to God, and when God is mashpia you, when God causes you to be, not only do you continue existing, not only are you sustained, but you have access to the yichud of God. You actually understand something about God, because that's part of the kedusha that flows to man. It's a package. Man exists, man understands as a result of this flow that goes from God to man, this shefa, this hashpor. And the hasaga, the comprehension that man gets, is what's called the yichud of God, because the essence of the knowledge that man has of God is hasagas yichudoi, the comprehension of the oneness of God. So we see therefore that if man does appropriate acts, if he does mitzvahs, then his existence is sustained. Not only that, but he gets a certain hasaga of God, because that is embedded in the flow that goes between God and man. That is embedded in the Kedusha flow. In other words, he receives what's called an or, a light, and a light is a metaphor for knowledge. He receives a certain understanding of God, which is the yichud understanding of God. Not only that, man also becomes powerful. Man is able to have power to promote that yichud. Therefore, man, if he does mitzvahs, is sustained, and he also has access to two things. One, he has access to oiz, which is power, and he has access to tiferes, which is beauty. And beauty means the knowledge of God is beauty. Okay? So man has access to oiz, power, and tiferes, which is beauty. He has access to the kedusha, the comprehension of that kedusha, which he himself receives. That awe, that light, that understanding, which is the yichud. Now what happens if that happens? Well, what happens is that truth prospers. Spirituality pervades Olam Hazeh, this world. Not only that, yeshivas are successful in raising money, because yeshivas want to promote the knowledge of God. They are successful. Health predominates. People are healthy. There's no disease. Crops do not fail. There is no such thing as crime. There's incredible peace. There are no tyrants. Dictators fail to ascend to power. That's all what happens when Jews do mitzvahs, the appropriate acts. Therefore, the flow goes to them, the Kedusha flow. Therefore, they have the power to spread the yichud of God itself. They comprehend the yichud of God, because that's what the flow gives them. They comprehend that all, the hasagas yichudoi, the comprehension of the oneness of God. In other words, they have access to the comprehension of yichud, and they are able to promote it throughout creation. And what man begins to see is what's called gili yichudoi, an enormous revelation of the presence of God. Now, if man keeps doing mitzvahs, then the yichud, the flow that man gets to himself, is so enormous that the Shekhinah rests among man. And the divine presence is the greatest comprehension of oneness of God that a man can have in Olam Hazeh. The divine presence actually manifests itself among men. Okay? Because, and again, that's a result of the power flow that man has. So therefore we see that man has the following if he does mitzvahs. He has, one, sustained existence. Two, he has access to the Kedusha flow, and it manifests itself in terms of power, oiz, and also or tiferes, the knowledge of the yichud of God. Three, that if the power that flows to him, the Kedusha, the holiness, the shefa, the hashpor that flows to him is so much that he actually is able to bring down the Shekhinah milamayli lamata. And what happens is there's an enormous revelation of the presence of God throughout creation. And we see that throughout. No crimes, no dictators, no disease, no famine. It's really an incredible utopian state. What happens if man sins? What happens then? Well, if man does inappropriate acts, if he does chatoim, sins, then what happens? Then the Kedusha flow, the hashpor, that causative force, that holiness that would flow to man and sustain man and give him access to the yichud, access to the Shekhinah, is disturbed. It's shunted. The Satan gets that. Because he is yonik, because of our inverse relationship. He is yonik. He derives the nourishment from the ore that we should have gotten, from the Kedusha that we should get. What happens? So instead of a tigburis Kedusha, a waxing or a growth of holiness, we begin to see a tigburis hara, the proliferation of evil, the exact opposite. What does that mean? It means the following, that the Satan is yonik. He derives the Kedusha, the shefa that man gets, he gets, because that's the inverse relationship. Off a toichal, you will eat the dirt of man, and he eats it literally. So the following things happen. The first thing that happens is that the Satan's existence is sustained. His existence is sustained by the sins of man. He's unique from that Kedusha. The second thing is that he has access to the yichud of God. It's incredible when we begin seeing what happens. That he has access to the ois, the power in that shefa, and he has access to the or, the beauty, the tiferes, the hasoga of that shefa. He actually has access to it, not us. What does he do with that? What's he going to do with the yichud of God? Well, because he has power as a result of that shefa, that hashpor, he denies the entry of the yichud into the bria. He denies its entry because since it's flowing to him, he can deny entry. He can stop it from coming into creation. So therefore we begin to see an enormous tikbura sarah. What do we begin to see? Sheker, falsehood predominates. Crime is rampant. Tyrants succeed. The world has dictators and tyrants, and we can't seem to get rid of them. Evil is all over. Dictatorships are successful. There is enormous sufferings, diseases among men. Famine. There's an incredible amount of the concealment of the oneness of God. Because the entire purpose of the Satan is to fool you into thinking, or rather to deny the presence or the knowledge that God is one. And the way he does that is by giving success to tyrants, or giving success to people, that they should think that they exist independent of God, and that they should think that they are an independent cause. Besides God, they can also get things done. That's called Ribi Koiches Mitzius, the multiplicity or plurality of forces and beings. Therefore we see that when the Satan has access to the Yichud, he is master the Yichud, he conceals it. Therefore every individual, every institution that conceals the oneness of God, that promotes the arrogance of man, the evil of man, materialism, pleasure, and so on, and atheism, these have enormous proliferation. They have enormous success. Why? Because the yichud is wrapped up in the Satan's hands. That's what it means. There is incredible tikbura sarah. And if you think that's all that happens, then take step number 3. Besides the fact that he's sustained, besides the fact that he has access to the yichud, therefore he can be master the yichud, he can masalik the shechina. He can remove the shechina. Why? Because the divine presence is the greatest statement of yichud. If the Satan has access to the amount of kedusha coming down to the Jews that would have given them the shechina, so he has the power to remove the shechina, because he has the power. He can remove the shechina because whatever power they get, he has. It's one against the other, that inverse relationship. So when the Satan grows, what's happening to the Jews, if what they are receiving is the kedusha on the level of the presence of the shechina, and they sin, then he gets the level of the shechina, and he's able to masalik the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom. He's able to remove the shechina. That's why God must leave, not because of chatoim in itself, because since the Satan is yonik from that kedusha, he is able to remove the shechina. Because if the Satan is able to hide the shechina, because that's the power given to him, God must remove himself in order to allow a hester, a concealment of the oneness of God to occur. Because that is really what the sins of man have done. And that is what happens. Now, if you think this is all the Satan gets, you are making a gross error. Not only is his existence sustained, not only does he have access to the kedusha, the hashpor that comes down to man. In other words, he has access to the yichud. In other words, he can be master the yichud in the world by holding the yichud back and eating off it. Spiritually, that is. It's not a physical act of eating, but it is a spiritual containment of that power that would have gone to the Jews. He contains it within himself, and it actually gives him enormous power to be successful and to do whatever he wants. Not only does he have that, but he also can masalik the shechina, which is the third thing I'd mentioned. But there's something even more devastating that he can do. He can take the yichud and allow it to come down to the earth. Interesting. So you think that's great. But of course you ask yourself, why would the Satan allow yichud to come down? What he wants is to conceal the oneness of God, not to promote its presence. Aha. But when the Satan gets the yichud, and if he wants to allow it to come down, what he does is he allows it to come down, and he gives it to people who are evil in themselves, who have chosen freely to do evil. He gives them the access to the yichud, and they distort the yichud. So therefore it comes out that these peoples or nations have partial truth and partial lies. And they now can turn around to the Jews and say, we have the truth and you have nothing. In other words, he uses the yichud itself as a weapon against the yichud of the Jews, which is incredible. In other words, he takes the yichud, allows it entry into creation, into the world. He gives it to the goyim. They take this oneness of God or the truth, and they distort it. And then they turn around to the Jews and say, we have the truth and you don't. And if you don't come under our fold, we will persecute you. Therefore, that is the fourth thing that the Satan can do. That if he wants, instead of containing the yichud, he can allow it entry into the world and distort it. And therefore, men use it against the Jews themselves, because they have what's called a partial distortion of the truth, which in many ways is worse than a lie altogether. Now, you may ask yourself, where do you see this? Where is this present? Okay. When you understand this, you will now begin to understand an incredible aspect of creation. We will now understand that a great deal of the history of the world, a history of mankind, of the Jews, is based on this fundamental principle that either we get the Kedusha or the Yichud or the Shechina, or he gets the Yichud or the Shechina. Or rather, he can access the Yichud of the Shechina. And that determines a great deal of history. And I am now going to mention several events that clearly illustrate this principle. Let us take a look at history, and you will see this principle clearly illustrated in a way that you probably never thought. One of the most significant events that ever happened to the Jews, of course, was the Proliferation, the destruction of the first temple. What happened at that time? Well, the temple was destroyed. We lost, of course. We lost the Shekhinah. But there are many other things we lost. We lost prophecy. Nevuah, prophecy ceased from amongst Jews at that time also. And of course, we lost the Shekhinah, and so on. Now, there is an interesting pasuk in Eicha. Malko v'soreha bagoyim. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Malko v'soreha bagoyim. Her kings and her officers, bagoyim, are amongst the nations, exiled amongst the goyim, the non-Jews. In Torah, there is no more Torah, because all the scholars are gone. V'gam nevi'eha lo'imotzu chazoin mi'Hashem. And also her prophets, the prophets of Jerusalem, find no more visions from God. This is a pasuk in Eicha. And of course it's talking about the Churban Bayis Rishon. That pasuk illustrates what we're talking about here. What does that mean? Let's see. What did the Jews lose? Well, the pasuk says, first of all, the kings and the officers, the Jews went into exile. That's the first thing that happened. The second thing is Torah was gone. Right? And the third thing is that prophecy was gone. Exile, no more Torah, and prophecy. This is what the pasuk points out to. But wait a minute. If that's what happens to the Jews, in other words, if the sins of the Jews and the Lashon Harah that they spoke was able to give the Satan the ability to makatreg against them, right? And as a result of that, as a result of the sins of the Jews, he was yonik from the Kedusha that they had, which is the holiness, the Shefa, which includes the presence of the Shekhinah, correct? Then obviously he takes it, because that's what happens. When we lose it, he gets it. When we lose that Kedusha, that holiness, he is yonik, he takes that holiness, and he derives his own existence. He sustains his being, and he grows from the Kedusha that we ourselves would have gotten, from the very same kind. Where do we see this? Okay. What did we lose? We went into exile, correct? Or rather, we lost what's called oiz, power. the Jews lost the power, the autonomy that they had, their own republic, their own nation, so to speak. At around the same time as the Churban Bayis in 525 BCE, the Roman Republic was founded. There you are, the switch. The Jews had the power, their own political autonomy. Before, that was part of the Kedusha or the Shefa that they were receiving. Instead, since the Satan was Yonik because of the sins and the Lashon Harah of the Jews, he was Mekatrik and took that Kedusha to himself. Therefore, the Ois went to the Satan and Rome was founded at about the same time that we lost the Beis HaMikdash. It's not a coincidence. Okay, so the Ois was transferred. That's what the pasuk means. Malka v'soreha b'goyim. We lost the Ois. Our kings and officers are amongst the goyim. We lost the Ois, and now the goyim have the O's. Rome is founded. That nation which would persecute Jews for the thousands of years, because we are still under the Shibud of Rome, the exile of Rome. That grew just around the time as the Churban, the destruction of the first temple. Okay, but that's the Ois. What about the Tiferes? What about the knowledge of the Yichud of God? What about the Hasoga, the Or, that understanding that Jews had? Well, Jews lost the Torah, right? They lost the Torah, which is the truth that is derived from cognition, from intellection. And who got it? The Satan. When the Satan got it, he took the Yichud that the Jews had, the truth, and he gave it to the Goyim. That is why you find that around the time of the Churban Bayis, what was founded? Greek philosophy. Greece was founded at the same time. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Parmenides, Pythagoras, all these people lived around the time of the Churban Bayis. Therefore, you see that power was lost to the Jews, and it went to the Goyim. Rome was founded. Torah was lost to the Jews. Therefore, the Satan took it, and he gave intellection, went to the West. That was the founding of Greek philosophy. Okay, so Torah to the Jews became Chochmah Chitzonis. Philosophy, Greek philosophy, went to the intellection, went to the West. And the next thing that we lost was, of course, prophecy. And prophecy, of course, is information or knowledge which is given to a prophet, not via his mind cognition, okay, but rather via through the intuitive senses. So therefore, we lost the intuitive ability to access knowledge, the Yichud of God, and of course, the Goyim got it. Because again, the Satan had it. He was unique from our kind of Kedusha, which is Nevuah, and the Goyim got it. How? Because at the same time as the Churban Bayis Rishon, Confucius lived, Confucianism, Buddhism was founded, and Lao Tzu, Taoism, was founded. In other words, it's an incredible thing. The whole basis of Western civilization and Eastern civilization, the Chokhmah that they have today, they got at the same time that we had the Churban Bayis Rishon. Do you think that this is a coincidence? No. It is because of the principle that I am telling you, that when we lose our Kedusha, our Shefa, which at the time of the Churban Bayis Rishon consisted of Ois, political autonomy, Torah, and Nevuah, when we lost that kind of hashpor which consisted of a holiness which was so great that it gave us these things, when we lost it, he was yonik it. He got the Kedusha, okay? And therefore, he was able to do not only Masalik the Shechina, remove the Shechina, because he had access to the Yichud of the Shechina, but he took it and distorted it, and he sent it down to the earth. He gave, of course, the intellection, the cognition, the cognitive philosophies went to the West. Philosophy was founded, Western civilization, because that is really based on Greece. And intuition or meditation went to the East. And that, of course, is akin to our nevuah, the intuitive ability of man to access knowledge of God. It's incredible that the whole basis of civilization happened, the beginnings happened at the same time that Jews lost the Shekhinah and the Torah and the nevuah. And the reason, of course, is because of what I'm saying. That is the inverse relationship that we have with the Satan. That is one event that is understood as a result of the principle of the inverse relationship that we have with the Satan. It's an incredible idea. Let's take another event. Another event is the following. Let's take the Churban Bayis Sheni, which is the next major cataclysm that happened to Jews. The next major tragedy. What happened there? We lost the Bayis Sheni. In other words, we lost the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah, of course, departed from us. The second temple was destroyed. Now, again, we had a political autonomy, not political autonomy, but we had autonomy because we were in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, we lost power, and the power went to the Romans in the form that they were able to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, the Romans, through the fact that the Satan can access the power of what we had through our Kedusha, the Romans got it, therefore they were able to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. They were able to be master the Yichud of God. Because once the Shekhinah departed, of course, there was enormous amount of Hester in the Bria, and evil and all sorts of things. Again, the inverse relationship. But that's the ois, that's the power, the success that we lost. The Romans got sufficient to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. But what about the Chokhmah? What about the Tiferes? What about the Torah that we lost? In other words, what about the Yichud of the Shekhinah itself that we lost, that he was able to get? Well, he took that, he distorted it, and he gave it to the Goyim in the form of Christianity. Christianity is a true distortion of Judaism. Why? Take a look. What do Christians say? They say that it is not you who are Israel, we are Israel. They say that it is not you who have the Torah, we have the Torah, we have the New Testament. It is not you who have the Mashiach, we have the Mashiach. That's incredible. Christianity isn't a religion that has its own doctrine. Christianity is nothing more than an opposite of Judaism. Why? There is no religion that is like that. All religions have their own doctrines, their own ideas that are independent of Judaism. When you take a look at Christianity, Christianity is an opposite, it's a mirror image of Judaism reversed. How? Because that is exactly what the Kedusha looks like when a Satan is Yonek. He takes the Shefa, the Kedusha that the Jews have, which of course is the Yichud of the Shekhinah. When we lose it, he gets it. And he takes that Yichud, distorts it, sends it down to the Goyim, and gives it to them. So they come up with a religion which is a complete distortion of Judaism. That's exactly what the religion is. And of course, what do Goyim would do with that? They say, we have the truth, therefore you must come over to us. And we have been persecuted by Christianity, the anti-Judaism, for 2,000 years. In other words, the consequence of the fact that the Goyim, or rather the Satan, has accessed the Yichud of the Shekhinah itself, has been Christianity and the persecutions for 2,000 years, which is really an incredible idea. Now, there is one more incident that I want to mention. There is one more incident that I want to mention. And that is, again, when the exile of the Jews really began. The exile of the Jews really began around 500 ACE. Because that's when the Jews began to be spread out all over the world. When they began to leave Bovel in Israel, and they began to be spread to all the communities. It started around 500 ACE. But again, if that means that we were going into worst exile, what that means is the Shefa that was coming to us would go to the Satan, he would be yonik and grow, and he would give it to the Goyim. What access? In other words, he would be able to access even more the Yichud of the Shekhinah that we were losing. And of course, since he accessed it, he gave it to the Goyim to persecute us. What was that Yichud? That Yichud was an incredible distortion called Islam. Islam occurred at the same time that the Golus really began in earnest for the Jews. And again, because Islam really is much closer to the truth than paganism, because they believe essentially in one God. But the truth is that they say to us, Islam, that of course our religion is the real religion, and how many hundreds of years has the Muslims persecuted the Jews? because they feel they have the one religion. So it comes out that the world has gone away from paganism, and it has gone to Christianity, which at least means that they believe in a Trinity, and not in the 1400 gods that Greece used to believe in Rome. At least they believe in three, or they say it's one deity in a Trinity, but it's sort of like three gods. But three gods is better than 1400. So they have come closer to the truth, but they have persecuted immensely, because the Satan has had access to the yichud of the Shekhinah, distorted the yichud and given it to them in the form of three, and they have persecuted us as a result, because they say that they have the truth. And the same thing, when we went into exile, Islam was founded, because again the Satan had access to the yichud of the Shekhinah. He gave it to the Goyim, so therefore the Arabs went from a pagan nation to a nation that believes in one God, which is an enormous advancement on their part, because the only thing that they really hold, which is a real distortion, is that Muhammad is a prophet. But the God, they believe God is